Welcome to the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat Program with Rabbi Shalom Rosner. Tzurba is a revolutionary halacha sefer which guides you through over 300 topics in Jewish law in a unique signature style. In this weekly series specifically, Rabbi Shalom Rosner learns through the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat volumes, helping us all master the halachot of Shabbat in just 2 years. Tzurba volumes are available for purchase worldwide on Amazon. And to learn more about Tzurba, or for those in Eretz Yisrael looking to purchase volumes, please head over to tzurbaolami.com. For more information, see the description below. And now, Rabbi Shalom Rosner.
Okay, we are up to the review sessions of volume number 18, volume 18 of the Tzurba Rabbanan. Again, the Lax Family Edition, and this volume was dedicated Leila Nishbas Yakir Hexter and David Schwartz, Zechronim Levracha, who gave their lives Al Kiddush Hashem in defending us against our enemies. So this volume we discussed Bishul D'oraysa. We had the second and the third shiur of Bishul D'oraysa. We discussed Bishul D'Rabbanan, Shehiyah Chazara Hatmana, and then we started to discuss other malachas, including Dash and Schita, and we started Borer. So it makes sense to split this up into three. So maybe we'll have three review sessions of this topic. So first, the first two shiurim, Bishul D'oraysa. We discussed Bishul D'oraysa in the end of the previous volume, but now let's get into other very important rules and regulations of Bishul. So we start again. We're not in the review. We don't review everything and as in depth as we discussed, but we will review what we can. So we discuss different sources of heat. Obviously, cooking midaraisa on a fire is Bishul D'oraysa, but we said there are other forms of cooking, including Kli Rishon, Iruy Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Iruy Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi. So all of those, let's get into the details of that. So the Mishnah tells us, Shabbos, I'm on page 23. Those who are following, the Mishnah tells us, Ha'ilfis v'ha'kadera she'avir merusachin. If you have a pot that is still boiling hot that you took off the fire, lo yitin l'tochan tavlin. You cannot put spices in it. Even though this is a pot that's no longer on the fire, you cannot put spices in it because it is a Kli Rishon shehusar me'al ha'esh. It has been removed from the fire, but it still cooks. It still has the power of cooking. You could put the spices into a ka'ara or tamchui, which is understood as a Kli Sheni. Why is it? What's the difference between a Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni? So this is a Yerushalmi that appears in Masechah Shabbos. That's what we have here. It also appears in Zeraim, I think in Maseches Maasros, that the first opinion in the Yerushalmi in source number 2 says, well, it depends if Kli Rishon is hot, Ziyat Soledas, and Kli Sheni is not. That's the first day of Rabbi Yonah. We don't of Rabbi Bun. We don't paskin that way. Rabbi Yossi ber Rabbi Bun, because we know, Tosfos points out, and the Mefarshim point out, and the next line of the Gemara points out, that you can have a Kli Sheni that's boiling hot, that's even hotter than a Kli Rishon. A Kli Rishon cools off a little bit, and a Kli Sheni is still boiling hot. You pour this directly from the Kli Rishon to the Kli Sheni. So that can't be the difference. So the language of the Yerushalmi is, Ela asu harchaka le Kli Rishon, velo asu harchaka le Kli Sheni. What is harchakas? The Ramban says that sounds like a D'Rabbanan. The Ramban says the whole idea of Kli Sheni being mevashel or Kli Rishon shehusar me'al ha'esh, right? The Ramban says that is a Isser D'Rabbanan, based on the lashon of harchaka. So we don't paskin that way. Most Rishonim assume that it's Bishul D'oraysa. The Rashba, Shabbos Daf Mem. The Rashba says, of course, it's Bishul D'oraysa. If it's Yatzo Ledispo, if it's a Kli Rishon off the fire, that still cooks B'D'oraysa. Says the Rashba, Mikol Makom Mistaver, De'eno Asa Lavashel, Keneganam Duralo B'Kli Rishon, Elatzoni L'Shalon Espashel. Avotzoni Shin Espashel, Afilu B'Kli Rishon, V'chul, I'm sorry, let's get to the point that I wanted to get to. V'amavashel B'Chayev Chatas Ki Mevashel Al Eish Mamish. Right, even if it's off the fire, still that is going to be Bishul D'oraysa, and that is Lamaisa doesn't matter because it's Bishul in a Kli Rishon Shehusar me'al ha'esh is still going to be Aser. But Machlokes Rishonim sounds like from that Yerushalmi the word harchaka, but we assume it's D'oraysa. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch says in Shin Yud Ches, which is the simon about Bishul. Shin Yud Ches Tes, source number 5, Kli Rishon. I'm in again the shiur Chazara, the shiurim, the first shiur in the 18th. The 18th volume. So Kli Rishon afilu la'achar she'aviru me'al ha'esh mevashel kol zman she'yatzo ledispo, as long as it's yatzo ledispo. Right, once it cools off to on the yatzo ledispo, we discussed in the previous shiur what is the temperature of yatzo ledispo. Once it's less than yatzo ledispo, then for sure there is no bishul. That's what the Mishnah Berurah points out. But while it's yatzo ledispo, still it is still going to be Bishul D'oraysa. So that is called the Kli Rishon shehusar me'al ha'esh. I take the soup pot off the fire. I can't put anything in there that has not been cooked. That's the world of Bishul D'oraysa. So the What is the difference between Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni? What about a Kli Sheni? So Tosfos, famous Tosfos, it's famous. We'll make it famous right now if you don't know it. Tosfos and Shabbos Daf Mem. Tosfos says, why is a Bishul and a Kli Rishon and not a Kli Sheni if it's not totally on temperature? So Tosfos talks about the tefanos, the walls, the sides of the container. That makes all the difference. As Tosfos, Shabbos Daf Mem, source number 8, Tema, Maishta Kli Sheni mi Kli Rishon. Right, what's the difference? If it's Yatzol this blow, then it's going to cook even in a Kli Sheni. If it's not so this blow, it doesn't cook in a Kli Rishon. So Tosfos says, because the Kli Rishon was on the fire, its walls keep the heat in, and it's continuing the heating process. Dofnos of Chamin u'masik chomos man meruba. But Kli Sheni, Tefanos Makaros. It's starting to go in the opposite cooling direction, and therefore it's mutter. We mentioned the Or Sameach has a different shot. These things, it's relating to other areas of halacha where you're farther from the source. Kocho, koach, kocho. In that world, that's what he talks about in Hilchot Shabbos. But that's the difference between Rishon Kli Sheni. Whatever the reason is, that's what we paskin. Kli Sheni is not mavashel, with the exceptions that we'll get to soon. So it's not lo lamaisa. But there is another rule of Davar Gush. Davar Gush, a solid item which we discussed. It starts off in Yeridea and then it's brought over to Arachayim. In Yeridea there is a machlokas, the Isser Veheter, which is we don't know exactly who wrote it, but it's late Rishon, probably late Rishon we'd call him. Says that the whole svara of Tosfos that Kli Sheni is namavashel is because of the walls, the funnus makaros, that should only apply to liquids. If you have a piece of meat, then the walls or the plate that the meat is on, if it's boiling hot, it keeps the heat in because there's no walls that affect it, that cool it off. And therefore, it says the Issa Veheter, the whole idea of Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, that chiluk does not apply by a Davar Gush. And the Marshal, Rabbi Shalom Rosner, the Yamshel Shlomo, in Chulin, picks up on this Issa Veheter and says, we're machmer like it. We're machmer like it. So for let's say you have a piece of a steak that was taken off the fire, that's put onto a plate, it's boiling hot, and you cut it with a milchik knife, that could be problematic. Because it's Davar Gush, and you don't say, oh, it's in a Kli Sheni, it's not mavashel. No, it's problematic. And that's what the Yamshel Shlomo says, we're machmir for Davar Gush. The Darkei Moshe, the Ramah is not. The Ramah in Yeridea, and he says the Beferish in the Darkei Moshe, we do not have to be machmir for a Davar Gush to consider that a Kli Rishon. So machlokas in Yeridea. Then step 2, do you bring this over, even if you're machmir in Yeridea, do you say it applies in Arachayim in Hilchot Shabbos? So the Magen Avram and some Achronim say l'chadchila yes. The Magen Avram says, source number 12 in Sheni Juches, v'chikasa apos can be Yeridea, the Davar Shu Gush, afilu b'Kli Sheni mevashel. Even in a Kli Sheni, v'kosher kein sli. So some say, the Magen Avram says, it should be brought over to Arachayim and Hilchot Shabbos, but the Chavos Das, the Nesivus, in his commentary in Yeridea, does not assume that you don't have to parallel. Even if you want to say it's boleya umavliya, the taste transfer, that doesn't mean Hilchot Shabbos has the same rules. And therefore, even if you want to be machmir, like the Marshal, like the Issa Veheter in Yeridea, which we're not sure, which is against the Ramah, still in Arachayim, you might say it does not apply. V'shar devarim chamim, af sheish b'lam de Kli Rishon, to the Kugon Davar Gush, the Marshal einem b'vashel. Even the Marshal might not say in Hilchot Shabbos. Even the Marshal might not say in Hilchot Shabbos. That's what Rav Avadia says. In Hilchot Shabbos, svek sveika. Svek sveika. The Mishnah Berurah says l'chadchila one should be machmer by a Davar Gush. Where does it come up? Let's say you have a big glob of boiling hot shulant on your plate. Make sure that you put a mechitza between that and the coleslaw or the salad. So l'chadchila we try to be machmir, but the Shmir Shabbos and others are also machmer l'chadchila, but Rav Avadia says maybe it's a svek sveika l'hakel. Maybe we pass like the Ramah in Yeridea, and if we pass like the Marshal in Yeridea, maybe we shouldn't bring it over to Hilchot Shabbos. So he has that svara l'hakel. Rav Moshe says, as we saw, at least you shouldn't have a double chumrah l'hachmir. To think that Davar Gush is like a Kli Rishon, and something we discussed in the last year, if there's Bishul Achar Bishul Bilach, so we pass can make it in Ein Bishul Achar Bishul. So we're machmer l'chadchila by liquids. So Moshe says to assume yesh Bishul Achar Bishul Bilach and Davar Gush, that will be a double chumrah. So Moshe says ketchup, putting ketchup on a boiling hot hamburger on Shabbos. So says Moshe that would be okay because assuming ketchup is a liquid, which is an assumption, but then it's already cooked, it's pasteurized, whatever it is, it's pre-cooked in the factory. So that's bishul achar bishul, and then to assume that Davar Gush, that's a double chumrah. So Moshe would say you wouldn't go that far. What exactly is a Davar Gush? So the Marshal said rice. rice is a Davar Gush. That's a chiddush because you might say only a solid item like a piece of steak or a one unit. But the Marshal said even if a glob of rice would also be a problem. So that's all Kli Rishon Shehusar Me'al Eish and Davar Gush, which might be a Kli Rishon. What about Iruy Kli Rishon? So this is a question that is not asked by the Bavli. The Bavli does not ask this question. What if I pour from a Kli Rishon before it hits a Kli Sheni, and the food is going to be on the bottom, is going to hit the food? So is that called a Kli Rishon or is that called a Kli Sheni? It's out of the surroundings of the Kli Rishon, like Tosfos talked about, but it's not in the cooling walls of the Kli Sheni yet. So the Yerushalmi talks about it. The Yerushalmi has a machlokes about it. Right? Yerushalmi seems to have machlokes. You have it there in source number 18. Litin tavlin milamata, valaros milamala. Rabbi Yonah says aser. Rabbi Yonah says aser because after all, we learned in a halacha in Hilchos Kodshim. Even if you pour boiling hot carbon liquid into a kli cheres, it's done. It's cooked there. And Rav Yossi says, no, maybe cheres is different. Don't compare that to our case. And the Gemara says, no, there it applies even by metal kalim. The maskan of the Gemara of the Rishalmi seems to be that Iruy is kli rishon. Iruy is a problem, but the Mefarshim explain, Tosfos explains that maybe we don't pass like the Rishalmi because there's a Bavli that has a sugi Maseches Pesachim called Tata Gvar. The item on the bottom overcomes the item on top. So Tosfos says maybe that Gemara in Pesachim Ayin Vav sounds like Iruy is not Kli Rishon. So this is a major machlokas Rishonim. 3 days of the Rishonim. Rashbam says Iruy is Kli Sheni, like that Gemara of Tatogvar. Rabbeinu Tam says Iruy is Kli Rishon, like the Yerushalmi. We paskin in the middle. If you remember, we paskin Mivashel Kidei Klipa, that day of Tosfos. Venira, source 21, Diri Lo Avi Kli Rishon, V'lo Kli Sheni, El Mivashel Kidei Klipa, meaning it cooks the outer layer. So Rishon Shabbos it cooks. It cooks, Lamaisa, it's aser, because it's Mivashel Kidei Klipa, and one has to be careful about it. And Yaredeya makes a difference, it only cooks the outer layer, so maybe you could be koleif, maybe you could take off the outer layer if there was a illegal or a treif taste transfer. So Lamaisa, we are machmir mevashel kidei. That it is mevashel kidei klipa. So let's say you want to have a second cup of tea. So let's say you have a couple of drops left in your cup. You have to be very careful because the boiling hot water is going to go on that water. So we assume that you don't have to do. Rav Moshe writes, and the Shir Shabbos discusses, that water was cooked already. If you washed out your cup and you have the water that was never cooked, okay, maybe it's more lechumra. But here, it's already cooked. It was already cooked. So now there's ein bishul achar bishul, and you don't really care if that water is heated or not. So the poskim assume that one doesn't have to be worried so much, as long as there's not a puddle in there. If there's a puddle, maybe you should be machmir if it's not warm anymore for bishul achar bishul. And Iruy mavashel k'tei klipa. But if not, it was already a couple of drops, and the poskim say that the Shevet HaLevi discusses if you're so machmir to try to dry it out, then you might come to schita if you put a paper towel in there to try to dry it out. So Lamaisa, if there's only a few drops there, we don't have to be worried. But that's Iruy. Iruy we assume is mevashel kidei klipa. We discussed a little bit, we're not going to review that now, about is there any maris ayah, something that looks like cooking in a Kli Sheni, but what's more lamaisa is the discussion of Kalei Bishul, which starts on 39. The Mishnah says, even though we paskin ein bishul achar bishul, even though we paskin there's no bishul in a Kli Sheni, like the Gemara says in Shabbos Daf Mem, Kli Sheni is not mavashel, but the Mishnah says it is mavashel certain types of fish, certain types of flaky items, what are called in halacha kalei bishul, things that cook very easily. That's the Mishnah in Shabbos Kuf Mehei. Rashi explains the kulyas is palanin, some type of fish. The way that you cook it is by sprinkling hot water on it. This is their gemar malacha, and this is bishul. And this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. The chumrah of Kalei Bishul. The problem is, we don't know what's in this category of Kalei Bishul. We know water is not. Water is not Kalei Bishul. But we just don't know what is Kalei Bishul. There's a question about how to read a Gemara, 2 days in the Gemara about salt. The Gemara talks about in Shabbos Mem Beis, 2 svaras, and the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah discuss it. But Lamaisa, we're not sure. We're not sure how to define Kalei Bishul, what's cooked easily, what's not cooked easily, and therefore we assume, based on a Ureim, that you never know. You never know. Therefore, it's a good idea not to put anything into a Kli Rishon, or even into a Kli Sheni. Don't put anything into a hot Kli Sheni that's still Yasser Ledisbo. If it's not Yasser Ledisbo, for sure it's okay. But don't put anything in. Says the Shmir Shabbos, you have it there in source 42. Mikivan sheyeshna ma'achalim, hamisbashlim gamba Kli Sheni. Since there are foods that cook in a Kli Sheni, ve'ein anachnu b'kiyim ladas eluhem, we don't know what they are. Yesh lahachmer v'lomar. One should be machmer. Shekol davar she'eno mevushal. Yesh bishum iser bishul gamba nesinasa b'Kli Sheni. Anything that you don't know, it might cook in a Kli Sheni. Right? Unless you know, if it's not Yasser Ledisbo, then fine. But if it is Yasser Ledisbo, one should be machmir. The Chazon Ish seems maybe not so machmir, but that's what we assume. That's what we assume. One should be very careful. Just put everything not in make sure it's not Yasser Ledisbo. And then you come to the world of Kli Shlishi. We discussed Kli Rishon off the fire, Davar Gush, Iruy Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi. What about Kli Shlishi? So the Gemara doesn't really talk about this. The Pri Megadim says it sounds like that only Kli Sheni is the possibility of being a problem. But Kli Shlishi, for sure, is the fact that the Gemara doesn't say a word about it, it must be, it's mutter. The Chazon Ish, based on the Chayadim, say no, exactly the opposite. If the Gemara doesn't say anything about Kli Sheni, you know why? Because there's no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Shlishi. If it's totally on temperature and Kalei Bishul will cook in a Kli Sheni, so Kalei Bishul will cook in a Kli Shlishi too. And that's what the Chazon Ish says in Arachayim, Nun Beis Yutes, in source 45. V'lo matzinim makar lachalik ben sheni l'shlishi. V'midvar mispashlim b'sheni, mispashlim b'shlishi. And then that cooks in a sheni, will cook in a shlishi also. V'ein adar tali ela b'chama mayim. It's only totally on the temperature of the water. Shiu chamim shayaso ledis bahem. And therefore says the Chazon Ish, there's no difference in a Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi. And Rav Moshe famously says Kli Shlishi doesn't cook anything. Put whatever you want in a Kli Shlishi. There are a couple of shuvas of Rav Moshe that shook the world, that the whole world relies on, and this is one of them. Kli Sheni. There are those that are machmir, like the Chazon Ish and others, but many say Kli Shlishi, whatever you want, put in a Kli Shlishi. That's the heter of Rav Moshe, and that's the heter of Rav Ovadia. And there are many examples of this. First and foremost, maybe all about tea. Before we get to the tea, first you have on page 46, 47, what about powdered soups? What about tradition soups, as they're called? So me'ikar adin Kli Shlishi would be okay. Well, according to Rav Moshe, would be okay. What about in a Kli Sheni? That's a little trickier, but it's discussed here. What about the powdered kafei names? What about other powdered soup? It's all cooked beforehand. So then one would be allowed to cook it because ein bishul achar bishul by those signs. But one has to be careful. Sometimes the little vegetables that they put in could be a problem, but that's one example. Making tea on Shabbos. Again, the Aruch HaShulchan says, he screams, he says making tea is a problem. And remember, he is not machalik. Sheni, Shlishi, it's Kalei Bishul, it's very thin leaves, and therefore one has to be careful. Rav Moshe would say, Kli Shlishi is okay. Kli Shlishi is okay. Remember, I think we mentioned in the past year, the Chazon Ish has another chumrah, that if you have a Kli Rishon that's still on the fire, and you transfer it to another Kli, that Kli is a Kli Rishon. Meaning, if I have the urn, and I put it from the urn into a cup, according to the Chazon Ish, that cup is a Kli Rishon, because it was mechubar to the Kli Rishon on the fire. The only time something is a Kli Sheni is if you pour into the Kli Sheni when the Kli Rishon is no longer on the fire. If the Kli Rishon is on the fire, then that's enough of a chibur that you'll need another cup. That's another chumrah of the Chazon Ish. But either way, what about tea? So Rav Moshe would say it's all mutter. It's all mutter in a Kli Shlishi. The Aruch HaShulchan has a line that, well, you see it's cooking because it gets colored. Rav Moshe says, colored? Even iced tea gets colored. Coloring does not reflect bishul. So, Machlokes, the Mishnah Brura is machmir, right? Regarding alei tea, the Mishnah Brura in source 54. He says you should make the tea essence before Shabbos, and then it's ein bishul achar bishul. But this is Rav Moshe would say everything in a Kli Shlishi is okay. Rav Schachter quotes Rav Soloveitchik that all the Soloveitchiks thought that tea were not Kalei Bishul, and you could put tea directly into a Kli Sheni. And he quotes that Rav Soloveitchik quoted that Reb Chaim, his grandfather, did that, and that is in terms of in terms of T and Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi. There is a chumrah known as the chumrah of the Chai Adam. It's called Yad Nichves Bo. It's based on a Yerushalmi, which the Rambam quotes. We know for Maisrus, I'm allowed to eat something out in the field. Right? Snacking, even without taking off Chuvas and Maisrus. But there are 6 events that the Gemara says in the Yerushalmi, it's in Yerushalmi and Maisrus, that are Kovela Maisrus, because these are Machshiv, the food, and once you do this, then you have to take off Maisrus, Chuvas and Maisrus. And one of them is cooking. So the Gemara talks about if it's in a Kli Sheni, so then there's no cooking, unless it's Yad Nichves Bo. If your hand is scalded, which is even hotter than Yad Soledis Bo. And the Rambam quotes that in Hilchos Maisrus. The Rambam says that if something is scalding, that's going to be Kovela Maisrus. Kovela Maisrus. So it says the Chai Adam, hey, if it's considered cooking for Maisrus, it's considered cooking for Shabbos, and therefore, even in a Kli Sheni, if there's Yad Nichves Bo, then for sure it's a problem. And the Chazon Ish and others say, but this is not quoted in Hilchos Shabbos. You must say for Hilchos Maisrus it's different. And I'll add, that whole halacha is a din d'Rabbanan, we paskin. Rambam paskins all 6. Some of them are D'oraysa, according to some Amoram, but all 6 are d'Rabbanan, and therefore, to say that applies to Hilchos Shabbos would be unusual. There was another major area of Bishul, and that is stirring, maggid. We know the Gemara tells us in Beitza, in source number 62, that maggid is part of the cooking process. You put the food in the pot, you put the fire on, and then you stirring. Stirring is part of the process of cooking. Why? What do I do? It moves things around in the fire. Things that are further away gets closer. Things that are not fully cooked get closer, and they get to be fully cooked. That's maggid. So if I'm maggid a pot, if I stir a pot on Shabbos, and there is it's not fully cooked. It's not mavushal kol tzarcho. That's Bishul D'oraysa, because I am hastening the cooking process of some of the items. That's part of the cooking, and that's Bishul D'oraysa. The chumrah is the chumrah of the kolbo. Someone's the chumrah of the kolbo. The kolbo says, even if something is mavushal called tzarcho, if it's on the fire, don't stir it. It's on the fire, don't stir it. That's the kolbo in source 65. V'kaimel demegas chay mishum avashel afilu b'keder mavusheles kozman sheyela eish. If it's on the fire, don't stir it. That's the chumrah of the kolbo. Why is it? What's the svara? So the Pri Megadim says, it really cooks. The problem is, if it's fully cooked, then even real cooking doesn't cook it. So it's not clear what the kolbo means. Some say that that's what the Sharatziya and the Mishnah Berurah wonders about the Pri Megadim. There's no bishul. So mistama, like Ramosha says, maybe it's based on the fact that there might be little pieces in there that are not fully cooked. You think it's fully cooked, but it's not fully cooked. So at least on the fire, one should be machmir. That is what we hold. The Mishnah Berurah quotes us, and all the Achronim quote this chumrah of the kolbo, that one should not stir anything, even if it's fully cooked. Let's say the cholent's in the crock pot, and it's fully cooked. I want to stir it so it doesn't burn on the bottom. Take it out of the crock pot first. Take it out, stir it, then put it back in, and then put the cover on and put it back in. Because even stirring it on the fire is the chumrah of the kolbo that we are machmer for lechatchila. If it was done, it doesn't answer the food, but we're machmer for that lechatchila. An extension of this is what I just alluded to: putting a cover on. If the food is not fully cooked, putting a cover on, that's for sure aser, because that's hastening the cooking process that B'ezras Hashem will get to. But even if not, let's say I took it off to stir it, I should put the cover back on first and then put it back on. Because even covering it is like stirring it. That's part of the process. Or we discuss ladling. Ladling. So when I ladle something, that's an extension of stirring. I'm not stirring, but once I ladle, then the food that was in one part of the pot goes to another part of the pot where the food with the food that I just took out used to be. So that's another chumrah. Again, ladling by a davar she'ein mavushal kol tzarcho, that's for sure a problem. But if it is mavush, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says in Shid Yuches Yudches, source 71, right? Ilfes v'kedera shehevir musach min al-gabi ha'arim lo nispashal kol tzarcho. You can't, even if it's off the fire. And the Mishnah Berurah quotes that maybe one shouldn't do this even while it's on the fire as an extension of the kolbo, but it's an extension, and therefore, if one does it just to remove some stuff without stirring it, let's say you take some of the top stuff of the cholent instead of going all the way down, then there is more room to be makel. But again, lechatchila, one should take it off and not do anything on the fire. Stirring it or ladling it. That's what the Aruch HaShabbos says in the last source towards the end, source 75. Kasva poskim de'ein lohotzi b'kaf tafshel mikdera homedas ala eish mishum shotzazu ma'areves as a tafshel. It stirs it around. Final af kasher tafshel mavushel kol tzarcho. Even if it's fully cooked, again, that's the chumrah of the the chumrah of the kolbo. Rav Ovadia is a little more mako, but this is the discussion of the kolbo and other issues of Bishul D'oraysa. That is the first shiur in the volume. The second one on Bishul. The next one we discussed the last part of Bishul that we discussed. Bishul Halacha de Bishul 3. Right, this starts on page 77, and this gets into This gets into some other Bishul issues, and that's Bishul Achar Afia Achar Bishul. Two Gemaras. It's basically a steer in the Gemaras, and the machlokas is how do you understand them? Which Gemara holds weight? It's a machlokas between the Ravya and the Uraim, and they're both quoted in Shulchan Aruch. That's the sugya. Two Gemaras, Psachim and Brachas, machlokas Rishonim, Ravya and Uraim. Two machlokas quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Gemara says in Psachim regarding the halacha of Korban Pesach. One is not allowed to cook the Korban Pesach. One has to roast the Korban Pesach. What if one roasted it? That's an Issa D'Oraisa. So the Gemara says, if the Gemara Pesachim Mem Aleph, source number 1 now on page 77, if I cooked it, then I roasted it, or I roasted it and I cooked it, I'm going to be chayiv. So if I cooked it first, the Gemara says obvious. But if I roasted it and then I cooked it, so it's already roasted. So why am I going to be chayiv for that? So the Gemara says, because Rabbi Yossi holds that when I cook something that was previously some other process had done to it, that's still considered the cooking. The second process has significance. If I have matzah, Rabbi Yossi says, and I cook the matzah, I'm not yotzei matzah. So you see from there that bishul means moist eat. Afia means dry heat. So you see from there, bishul achar afia is significant. And therefore, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. It's also to do that for the Korban Pesach. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Right? That's Rashi, Psachim Mem Aleph. V'yafi bishakvar nefa bataner, even though it's already baked. Hol v'chazar ubishlo, bitlo mitaras lechem. Wow, you were mevatel it from bread. Right? And based on that, the Iruy, Rabbi Elazar Metz, one of the Bali Atosvos, a Talmud of Rabbeinu Tam, he said, you see from there, yesh bishol achar bishol. Yesh bishol achar tzli, yesh tzli achar bishol. If the process is different, if it's the same exact process, we mentioned that in earlier shiurim, ein bishul achar bishul, ein afia achar afia, yesh bishul achar bishul, balach maybe as a chumrah. But here, if you change the process, if it's dry and moist, bishul achar tzli, tzli achar bishul, that is a problem. That's the Iruy, based on the Gemara in Psachim. But then you have the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas says, eating cooked vegetables, you make a hadama. Make hadama on cooked vegetables. Why? Because, it's cooked. That doesn't change anything. What about Rabbi Yossi by matzah? That's a special din by matzah. Special din by matzah, because the tam matzah is important. Tam matzah, you should be the tam matzah of a lekka. If Rabbi Yossi will be moded by vegetables, by shlokas, you make adama. So what do you see from there? It's a special din by matzah, but usually a second process wouldn't change it. And that's what the Ravya says. The Ravya quotes one of the great Chachmei Ashkenaz. He quotes the Iruy and argues and says, V'la milsahi, in source number 5. The Gemara in Brachas brings it and says, Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yossi ala gabe matzah. Tam matzah b'fiv aleka. Right, it's tam matzah. So therefore, says the Ravya, it is not a problem. The Shulchan Aruch quotes both opinions. Yesh misha omer, Sheni Chesifhei. Yesh misha omer, the Davar shenefe o nitzle. If something is baked or roasted in bishlo achar kach, if then it's cooked b'mashke, yesh bo mishum bishol. Bishal achar afia. The also litin pasa afilu b'kli sheni she'atzol ledesbo, and you can't put the bread in because bread is, let's say, Kalei bishul. The yesh batirin and something is mutter. That's the Ravya, machlokas Uraim and the Ravya. The problem is that there's a so what do we paskin? So the Ramah says yesh lahachmer no gilujal chadchila. Shulchan Aruch is not 100% clear. But the problem is that the Shulchan Aruch later on in the same siman in Sif Tezvav seems to be mekel. The Shulchan Aruch says in source number 7, Davar she's basha called sarcho. It's yavesh. You could put it next to the medura, right? You have something that had cooked in soup, and you could warm it up again. So the Bir Halacha leaves it tzarachian. So the Chazon Ish says maybe, and this is a huge, very important, significant shita. Maybe the Shulchan Aruch is saying Sli achar afia or sli achar bishul or afia achar bishul. It's only when you're doing something significant and changing the taste and changing the form. Warming something up is not called sli. That's not called sli. If you barbecue something after you cooked it, that's going to change something. But let's say you had meatballs. You had meatballs that were in a thick gravy, and then you want to warm that, and that was cooked. Now you want to warm it up on Shabbos. You're not going to warm it up with the gravy because you're going to take it out of the gravy, put it in tin foil, and put it on top of the crock pot. So is that a problem of Afiyach or Bishul? Says the Chazon Ish, no, because that's warming it up. Same thing with schnitzel that was fried. So that is a huge, important chiddush, and it makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. That's the Chazon Ish in source number 9. The kol shelo yavel atam tzli mamish alashis yabesh ksas ein bazeh mishum bishul. Achar Bishul. The Rav Avadia suggests that maybe the answer to the seer is that the Shulchan Aruch really paskins like the Kulashita. Right, you get into rules of when the Shulchan Aruch quotes 2 opinions. What does he paskin like? So the Rav Avadia, it says maybe we paskin Meker Adin Lakula. Meker Adin Lakula. Not everybody agrees to that. Even Sephardic poskin. Rabbi Tzion Abishol says L'chadchila one should definitely try to be machmir, and that's what we assume. Ashkenazim for sure assume l'chumra l'chadchila. So again, whenever there is a change of type of cooking, dry to moist, moist to dry, so we try to be machmer. And he talks about, I think, more of an English minhag, putting biscuits into hot tea. So the biscuits that were nefeh, that's baked, and he put it into boiling hot tea, so that's cooked. So that could be afiyah. That could be bishul achar afiyah. Right? What about putting bread croutons, putting the yellow osem soup nuts into those are deep fried. So that's not an issue. That's bishul achar bishul. But what about putting bread into, let's say, baked croutons? Can you put them into the boiling hot soup? So if it's not Yasser Ledispo, then it's for sure okay. But if it's Yasser Ledispo, is there an issue? So that's the Mishnah Brura. In a few places wonder, what if you used a ladle in between? If it's really a Kli Sheni, if you pour directly from the boiling hot soup pot to your bowl, that's an issue. That's a boiling hot, that's a Kli Sheni that we said in the last year, Kli Sheni might be mavashel by Kalei Bishul, and therefore don't put the matzah in, don't put the bread in. But most of us use a ladle. So the ladle, there's a seer in the Mishnah Brura about what's a ladle. So the way the Pri Megadim answers is that the ladle is considered a Kli Rishon, because it goes into the Kli Rishon. We're not sure Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, treat it like a Kli Rishon. The bowl, treat like a Kli Shlishi. It's either a Sheni or Shlishi, so we can make it, treat it like a Kli Shlishi. And therefore, put whatever you want into the soup based on that. If you hold like the Rav Moshe, that a Kli Shlishi is not mavashel at all, then it wouldn't be a problem, even if we're machmer, to assume yish bishul achar afiyah achar bishul, but putting it into the soup would not be a problem if it is a Kli Sheni. The Aruch HaShabbos says that in Surah 17, Ein litain prusos chala o matzah b'toch marach cham she'atzor ledispo munah b'Kli Sheni shemiyish lachush apasi mekali bishul. And therefore one should be careful. But again, if you used a ladle, so then that would solve the problem. Anyway. And b'diavad is for sure not a problem, because we might not hold to the whole chumrah. It's a couple of chumras of this being Kalei Bishul and Bishul Achar Afiyah, all of those. Good, and that's what a number of the poskim say. The Rav Ribiat and the Lamates Malachas, one may place a pot roast, fried or marinated chicken, potato laka, scrambled eggs on the top of a pot or pan, standing on the blech, right, rewarming it. Big discussion we had then a little bit about coffee, about can one prepare ground coffee that was roasted but not brewed. So it's not so clear. You can look at the evidence and the article written by Rabbi Heber that's quoted here on page 87. What about making toast on Shabbos? So we saw a chiddush. The Sholem Meshev, Rav Yosef Shal Nathanson, one of the greats from the 1900s, one of the great poskim, said, you can't make toast on Shabbos. Right, taking bread and toasting it, because that's change it. Panitzin. That's the issue. Why? Because of the Rambam. The Rambam defines Bishul D'oraysa as hardening something soft or softening something hard. So if you have bread that's soft and you're hardening it, that's Bishul. That's Bishul. So that's a chiddush gadol. Right, everything that you soften, even through heat, everything that's the Rambam and the Sholem Meshev based on the Rambam. So you assume like metal, if you melt metal, but bread, making it toast, is that a real change? The Tshuvas Rav Pa'alim, the Ben Ish Chai wonders. He says, "Ve'ein ze dimyon in din hamarapeh davar kasha," because of a Rambam. Right, the Rambam's talking about mavashel, and here it's already baked. And therefore, he did the Rav Pa'alim does not think it's a problem, unless if you have a hard piece of bread that's totally inedible, the opposite. Machmashin is yashin yamim harbe. You can't eat it at all, and you soak it in water. So then, soak it in soup. So maybe that's gemar malacha. That would be makabeh patish. That wouldn't be mavash, it would be makkah b'patish. Rav Ovadia quotes both of these and says they're both, I don't think, is right. I don't think it's toast is a problem of bishul, and I don't think it's makkah b'patish, which doesn't apply to food. And therefore, Rav Ovadia does not think it's a problem to make toast. Again, if you can make toast in that way on Shabbos. The Bir Halacha also discusses this. Dinyan makkah b'patish b'davar ochel u'davar chadash l'nimsa b'poskim. Say makkah b'patish is applies to food is a chiddush. We discussed a little bit after that expediting the cooking process on page 93. So any type of makarev bishulo, if someone's going to cook in half an hour and I do something and I move it closer to the fire, so that's Bishul D'oraysa. Even though it's going to happen anyway, but if I hastened it, so that's going to be bishul. If there's a pot that doesn't have a cover on it, that's not mavushal called sarcho, and I cover it, that's a problem. That's makar bishul d'oraysa, not just the kolbo that we don't understand. The kolbo is if it's fully cooked and I put the cover on, and that's an extension of the stirring, like we said before. But if it's not fully cooked, then for sure it is a problem. One has to be very careful about that. Remember we discussed the machlokas Rambam Rashba weeks ago in terms of what's Bishul D'oraysa. The Rambam says even up until Mavushal Kotzarcho. The Rashba, if I remember, said only up until Machol Ben Drusoi, but the Rambam says all the way to Mavushal Kotzarcho, it is still Bishul D'oraysa. So any type of hastening, cooking, moving something closer to a fire. Some posts can talk about if I have water in a crock pot at the beginning of Shabbos and it's not fully cooked yet and I remove some, so then the rest of it's going to cook faster. That could also be a problem. One final possible issue of the cooking issue, a changing form, is what about dealing with ice cubes? Melting ice cubes, making ice cubes. So it's all based on a Gemara in Shabbos Daf Nun Aleph. The Gemara says you can't crush snow or ice. You can't crush snow or ice on Shabbos, but you could put them in a cup. That's what the Gemara says. What's the issue? What's the issue that the Gemara is talking about? Why can't you crush and why can you put it in a cup? So three-way machlokas Rishonim. What is the issue in the Gemara? Right? The Rashi says there it is molid. You are creating something. When you crush ice, you are creating liquid actively, and that's dami limilacha. That's Rashi. Shebore hamayim ha'elu. You are creating the water, right? Bore mayim ha'elu. That's Rashi. If you look in the Rashba there quotes the Sefer HaTruma, or the Sefer HaTruma himself is in one of the Rishonim. He says it's not molid, it's nolad. Nolad. What's nolad? Rashi, what did Rashi say? You're creating the water. You're actively creating the water. So according to Rashi, if you did it into a cup with water in it already, why would it be mutter? Because mistama, it's not nikar. But the Sefer Truma says that if you are crushing it, it's not crushing. It's nolad. It's like a muksa issue. The Rashba understands the Sefer Truma. It's not like the Sefer Truma would say that even if you just leave it out next to fire, if you melt something next to fire, that's going to be nolad issue. Even if it's not going to get the azoledispo, you're just warming it. Still, it's a muksa issue. Right, that's so kushabara nimche as hu misar. If you're going to put it again in something else, it's not nikar at all when it changes form. That's why even the Sefer Truma will be makel. But if it's in its own bowl, let's say ice cubes in a bowl, according to Sefer Truma, that bowl, that water would be muksa, and therefore you should first put a little water into the ice cubes where the ice cubes are. That's what he would say. The Rashba and the Rambam sounds this way too. The Maggid Mishnah points out that it's a totally third issue in the Gemara. It's gzeira. It looks like schitas peiros. Right? You're not allowed to squeeze fruit, which we discussed in schita, and we'll review again. But schitas peiros, you're not allowed to squeeze juice out of fruit. So that's what this is like. Crushing ice kind of like is a similar type of action, and therefore that's why it would be a problem. L'may nafkamina in all of this, like I just said. Let's say you have an oily something kugel that you're going to put. You want to make uncongealed and melt. So according to the Truma, you can't put that next to a heat source. You maybe even not next to a heat source. That's nola, just to have it melt. Mashenkin, when it comes to the other Rishon, and they would say only active. Rashi is molid, or the Rashba is shchika samamanim. What do we hold? So the Shulchan Aruch is mekel. The Shulchan Aruch in Sheni Ches says mutter litinam panda keneged eish. You have an oily kugel. You can put it next to a place where it's not going to get to. Well, even if it's going to get the Yatzel let this bow, because it's Bishul Bishul by Yavish, we learned. But the Ramah says, like the Sefer Truma. like the Sefer HaTruma. And b'makom tzarech, he can be mekel. He can be mekel b'makom tzarech. Unlike the Sefer HaTruma. So based on that, the Mishnah Berurah discusses what do we paskin, and we saw some of the defrosting issues, and that's what the Aruch Shabbos says. One ein l'rasek, page 40, source 46. Ein l'rasek kerach v'shalag hofchan l'mayim. One should not crush ice into water. Right, that's all three into a just a cup. You could put ice cubes into water. Oh, mashke, acher, veins a kolabis or risuk. That's not risuk. That's not molded because you're not actively doing something. The truma would be mako, even the sefer truma, because it's not nikar. Right, when it melts, it's in the liquid, and it's not similar to squeezing fruit. Haposkim nechliku emesel rasei kerach l'hof chalamayim nemer gam ba'ovan shekerach nimsa b'toch hamashke. Rabbi Yoskim etiru, some are machmir. Okay, that's the Aruch Shabbos. And again, some say, I didn't mention this last time, maybe even stirring it to make it melt faster. Maybe that could be an issue. But again, I think Me'ikar Adin, we're making about that. So what about next? We discussed related heating congealed fat or gravy. So this would be the Sefer Chuma would say that would be a problem, but the other poskim would say, no, it's yavesh. You go by room temperature. By room temperature, we discussed that then. By room temperature, this is yavesh. Therefore, ein bishal chabishal be yavesh. Some are machmer and say no, but when it melts, it's liquid. No, we paskin Me'ikar Adin ein bishal chabishal when it comes to yavesh. What about making ice cubes? So we said lechatchila. The Mishnah Berurah, the Shmiras Shabbos says. Shmiras Shabbos says better. He doesn't say usser. He's very meduk in his lashon in source 51. Better not to put ice cubes in. Why? Tov liman milasi b'shavos yadav mayim amanas lo'ofchan l'kubias karach. Unless there's a tzara gadol, which means you're having guests over and it's hot outside. That's the Shmiras Shabbos based on that sefer truma that you are. It's gonna be a new form. But Rav Moshe and the Tzitz Eliezer and other poskim say no, it's not a problem. It's not a problem to make the ice cubes. After all, the Rav Moshe says. You don't find in the Gemara, it's also to put water outside where it's going to turn to ice. It's not an issue. So therefore, many poskim say it's mutal chachila. For sure, if you need it, you need it. Maybe towards the end of Shabbos at Shalosh Shudas and your ice cube trays are empty. You don't have to fill them up and put it back in the freezer half an hour before Shabbos is over. Forget the hachana issues, but you don't have to put that in. But other than that, if one needs it, then one would be allowed. And then we also saw the Shevet Alevi discussing maybe better not to make jello on Shabbos. Maybe that's also a type of molid based on this Sefer HaTruma. So these are the two shiurim in this volume relating to Bishul D'oraysa. Next time we'll try to Chazar the three Isurei D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah, HaChazara, and Hatmana.